When the one person who should never want you back gives you the touch you've been yearning, what do? I never intended for it to occur. It was only a hug, an ordinary daily hug. The affection a mother shows her adult stepson upon his return from college. Cozy, informal, and secure. That's what it was meant to be, anyway. But I knew this was different the moment his arms encircled me. His figure was wider and taller than I recalled. I felt my breath catch as his chest pressed against mine. In addition to cedar, he had a deeper, muskier scent. Not a boy's fragrance, but a man's. Then I felt it as I started to draw away. Hard, firm, and thick against my abdomen, even through our clothing layers. I gasped silently. My mouth parted. He did not recoil, didn't stutter out a sorry. I was just held there by him. I could feel every inch of what I had awoken in him as his fingers flexed against the small of my back. And I froze. Not out of disgust, not in a fury. However, in hunger. We parted too soon. We both pretended it hadn't occurred, as any embarrassed 22-year-old would. He rubbed the back of his neck and murmured, "Sorry, didn't mean to squeeze so hard. It's okay." I lied when my cheeks were burning and my voice was too high. It wasn't okay, though, because I now knew. I had sensed it now, and like a live wire, the awareness of what he wanted and what I immediately desired hung between us. I played it again to myself that night while my husband slept next to me in my bed. The way my hips had touched his breath had caught. He seemed to be resisting the impulse to grind into me, as shown by the way his grasp had tightened for a brief while. His eyes had darkened by the time I took a step back. For one prohibited second, his eyes fell to my mouth. I slipped my hand beneath my panties waistband, pretending it was his fingers rather than mine. I bit my lip bloody to keep quiet since I finished so hard. I persuaded myself it was a fluke the following morning. A biological mishap. Not much more. Then, however, with water droplets still sticking to his chest from the shower, he entered the kitchen shirtless. But as he reached for the coffee behind me, he unintentionally scraped my back. However, when I leaned over the dishwasher, I noticed that he was staring at the way my robe opened. And each time, I leaned into it rather than turning it off, allowing my robe to slide a bit more, allowing a little more time for my touch to remain, letting him know how much I was impacted by his attention. One gloomy afternoon, everything came to a head. My spouse was at his job. The only sound in the home was the rain drumming against the windows. Then Richard appeared, standing in my bedroom doorway. His eyes met me. He said in a gruff voice, "We need to talk." I understood his meaning. I was aware of the consequences of allowing him entry. Still, I moved out of the way. First, he didn't touch me, simply stood there, his chest bouncing up and down too quickly. He said, "You felt it, not a query. Fact, I could have denied it. It was possible to play dumb." Rather, I muttered the truth. Indeed, he tightened his jaw. "You didn't push me away either. One more reality. No." Between us, the air crackled. Then he took 2 steps to get closer. My face is framed by his hands. He growled in his voice, "Tell me to stop." I had no intention of stopping him. I adored it. Hot and demanding, his mouth slammed into me. As if he possessed me, his tongue swept in. God bless me, I desired it. I wasn't like this all the time. At one point, I thought there were good and wrong, and I associated the word sin with something. However, loneliness transforms you. Your soul is rewired by need. Although I hardly recognize myself in the mirror these days, my name is Grace. I should have been content with the cozy middle age I'd fought so hard to achieve at 43. A well-known interior designer with a lovely suburban home. A successful cardiologist for a husband and a mother. That's where the story becomes tricky, though. Charleston, South Carolina is where I grew up, the child of a devout Southern Nina pastor and his silently unhappy spouse. There were many regulations in our home, but there was no warmth. I was taught early on that a woman's value was determined by her purity, and that desire was something that could be prayed away. I was so desperate for love by the time I met Richard at the age of 28 that I mistakenly believed his clinical, chilly attentiveness to be love. When we got married, Miles was 45 years old. Rich, handsome in that prestigious silver fox fashion, and completely emotionally devoid. He discussed his business over a number of pricey dinners throughout our relationship, and I nodded in agreement. The closeness was effective. In 15 minutes, there will be 3 positions, all in the dark. This is what adult love looks like, I told myself. I believed that perhaps this would strengthen our bond when we adopted Richard at the age of 16 following the deaths of his parents. Rather, it provided Richard with yet another somebody to disregard. My marriage had turned into a lavishly ornamented tomb by the time Richard departed for college. Like ghosts, Richard and I moved throughout the house, only spoke to each other to arrange our routines. Other than the occasional stiff goodnight peck, we hadn't touched in years. At 2 a.m, I occupied the quiet with work, wine, and Instagram scrolling, wondering how other people's lives seemed so full while mine seemed like a waiting room. Then, over summer vacation, Richard returned home. At 22, Richard was a far cry from the awkward adolescent we had taken in. His slender body had been sculpted into something tough and hazardous by prison exercises. His brown hair always appeared a little disheveled, as if he had just emerged from the wind. Those eyes too green, constantly observing. Always knowing too much like the sea, before a storm. Maternal pride, I told myself, was the reason I noticed that all mothers were proud of her stepson's development. My mouth, however, dried up in a way that had nothing to do with parenthood when he emerged from the pool, shirtless, water running down the ridges of his abdomen. Began modestly, lingering looks when he believed I was not watching. When he would bend over my shoulder to look at my phone screen, my heart would race. My back was pressed against his chest. He was staring at me with a man's eyes, not a stepson's. The night I came downstairs in my silk robe, I ought to have put an end to it. I should have dressed more and given us more room. Rather, I looked for excuses to stoop when he was close by, to unintentionally bump into him in the kitchen. Every little transgression gave me a rush that Richard hadn't given me in 10 years. In reality, he is not my stepson. It is merely innocent flirtation. I'm worthy of feeling desired. The most harmful falsehoods are the ones we tell ourselves. After drinking too much wine the night before the hug, I made the mistake of looking through old pictures. Richard's high school graduation and our wedding day. Every moment that ought to have had significance. The loneliness was as painful as a bodily ache. At midnight, Richard discovered me sobbing in the kitchen. He didn't inquire about the issue, simply drew me into his embrace. Against my cheek, his heart beat steadily. He wasn't my stepson at the time. He was merely a man providing solace to a woman who had been going without food for too long. That's when I realized I had already lost my way. There are some boundaries that should never be crossed. But I knew as soon as his lips met mine. All my life I had been rushing toward this catastrophe. It was the sort of summer night that had an electric charge to it. The prospect of rain permeated the air. Richard was gone attending a symposium on medicine, another weekend spent by us in our overly large home. I had sipped wine on the patio that evening, observing the sky become darker, trying not to remember how Richard's hands had flexed around my waist 3 days prior when we had hugged, attempting and failing. There Richard discovered me, in my flimsy sundress, barefoot, curling up in the patio chair. The hem was riding up my thighs. At first he remained silent, simply leaned on the railing. Sweat on his chest was sticking to his white t-shirt. There was no longer a void in our stillness. It weighed a lot. "There will be storms," he whispered. He sounded rougher than normal. I sipped my wine again. Around the glass, my fingers shake. I enjoy storms. Then he made a move. He was across the terrace one moment. He was directly in front of me the next time, taking the wine out of my hand. With purposeful lingering, his fingertips touched mine. I gasped. He added, "You've been avoiding me." I took a swallow. We ought not to. What shouldn't happen? The rim of my glass, where my lips had been, was traced by his thumb. Say it. Couldn't. There was a burst of lightning, shedding light on his hunger. He murmured, "I dream about you." So softly that I nearly missed it. Each and every evening. Your scent. How you walk. In my ears, my heartbeat screamed. This was incorrect. So incorrect. My thighs, however, collapsed spontaneously as his free hand moved up my exposed calf. "Richard, tell me to stop." He clenched his fingers. "Now I ought to have." "God, I ought to have. Rather," I muttered. "Continue." He pulled me up against him, shattering the glass on the patio stones. Hot and demanding, his mouth slammed into me. As if he possessed me, his tongue swept in. And I gave him permission. I hoped he would. His hands were all over the place, grabbing my hips, tangled in my hair, and slid beneath my dress to palm my back. He hoisted me onto the railing, and I gasped. My thighs are being dug into by the wood. He pushed his body between my legs. "Whoa!" He grinded his teeth against my neck and snarled. "You feel fantastic." I sensed him, hard and insistent through his jeans, the whole of him. I caressed his back with my fingers. My waist was encircled by my garment. As he pulled me inside, the first drops of rain brushed on my skin. Our hands were ripping at garments, and our mouths were still joined. He was on me before we had even reached the couch. My collarbone was scraped by his fangs. He hooked his fingers into my underwear. I really wanted this. He insisted that I look at him. And when I did, I was overcome by the unadulterated yearning in his eyes. It wasn't love. It was not even love. It was consuming. And I didn't scream in pain when he finally pushed inside of me. It came from the horrifying knowledge that I had been waiting all of my life for this. Richard then traced the wedding band I was still wearing as we lay entangled in the ruins of my marriage. "Does he force you to end that way?" I shouldn't have been excited by the question. However, it did. "No," I said with a broken voice. "Never." His smile was possessed and dark. "Excellent." And I was his in an instant. It was intended that this would be the only time. However, that is not how addiction operates, particularly when you share a residence. The evidence strewn all over my bedroom floor was illuminated by sunlight that came through the curtains. We were too agitated to properly dispose of the condom wrapper, his t-shirt, and my ripped underwear. Before daybreak, Richard had disappeared, sneaking back to his room. However, my linen still smelled like curd. I should have been embarrassed. Shame. Anything but the hum of electricity under my skin. This overwhelming urge to repeat everything. My phone then buzzed. My chamber. 10 a.m. He'll be at the medical facility. My thighs tensed after reading those 3 phrases. We started acting carelessly. The whirring dryer was jammed up against the washing room. Richard's golf game during the weekend at the pool house. Against the refrigerator once. As Richard did it with such force that the magnets rained onto the floor, my legs curled around his waist. When Richard returned home early after surgery, we almost got caught. I was smoothing my dress before Richard could even fasten his slacks. His mouth left my lips swollen. "You're flushed," said Richard. Nothing was missed by his surgeon's eyes. Medicine for allergies. With my heart pounding, I lied. He was already looking over patient charts when he gave an absent nod. It was sweet at first. He would make me coffee the way I wanted it. As he passed the drink, his fingers lingered. How Richard would ramble on about hospital politics while he watched me across the dining table with dark, shrewd eyes. Then the text began. "I must see you. Right now. Tonight, put on the red underwear. What would you like me to do to you? Orders rather than requests. And when I wasn't quick enough to reply, don't force me to look for you. First, I located the receipt, a jewelry store charge of $300. It's not my birthday. It's not our anniversary. Next, the fragrance. His jacket was clinging to something cheap and flowery. Richard simply grinned when I challenged him. "Claire, I'm jealous." It hurt to hear the pet name. Months ago, he had stopped referring to me as Mom. She is nothing. I was pressed up against the wall as he spoke. When you're not available, someone to kill time. As I desired, his fingers moved between my thighs. Unless you're after me exclusively, I came crying and furious, detesting him and myself even more. One night over scotch, Richard stated, "You've been distracted." He spoke in that nonchalant, risky manner that surgeons have before they make their first cut. I made an effort to grin, only working on the Montgomery project. He gave his glass a swirl. "Richard has changed recently." My spine became slack. "In what way?" More assured, as if he's received precisely what he desired. I was pinned by those icy blue eyes. "Do you know what that could be?" Richard cornered me in the walk-in closet that evening. He held on gently. He hissed, "I'm done sharing you. Inform him of your desire for a divorce." I gave an incredulous laugh. "Then what? We lead a happy life together." His strong, possessive mouth slammed into my. As I say, we live our lives. The lust was broken for the first time by fear. In his workout bag, I discovered the thumb drive. Hundreds of pictures, videos. Each stolen moment is painstakingly documented. I was in ecstasy. On fingers entangled in his hair, my wedding ring gleams, as well as a folder named Insurance. It was 3:17 a.m. when Richard texted me. "Hospital emergency meeting. Avoid waiting up." 30 seconds later, Richard S. following. "My bed. Right now." It was too well timed. The phrase is too similar. Finally, understanding. I stood motionless in the dark. Passion was never the issue here. It had to do with power. I had also given him all of his weapons. Not all decisions are made instantly. They are just made public, in the manner of a knife sliding between ribs. Before you ever experience agony, the cut occurs. The smell of our bodies filled the air in our bedroom. Sweet, musk-filled, and tinged with guilt. I was squashed against the mattress by Richard S. Waite. He moved with the slow, methodical pace of someone who knew precisely what he was doing to me. His sweat-slicked flesh clinging to mine. The rumpled blankets were dotted with strange blue shadows from the 2:17 a.m. illumination of the digital clock on the nightstand. Richard was working an overnight shift at the hospital. Once more, my earlobe was scraped by Richard S. teeth. "You're considering him." No, I wasn't. Not at all. However, the thought of my husband made me feel sick all over again. I started to tell a falsehood. The front door then slammed. He's jingling. The click of dress shoes on marble. Richard arrived home early. Richard stopped above me. I still have his stick buried deep within me. We were not breathing, remained motionless. Except for Richard's increasingly loud footsteps coming down the corridor. The house was quiet. We had unlocked our door. Richard fixed his gaze on mine, dark with a challenge that wasn't fear. I bit down on a moan as his hips rolled once, purposefully. I pushed at Richard's chest and whispered, "Richard's room, right now." He smirked before he finally withdrew, and I gasped at his departure. As Richard's shadow emerged at the top of the stairs, I watched with a pounding heart as he stealthily slipped into the hallway after grabbing his jeans. Richard came in, and I dragged the blankets up to my chin. He appeared worn out. His salt and pepper hair was untidy, and his normally immaculate white coat was creased. "You're conscious." His eyes strayed to my red cheeks. My neck was stuck with knotted hair, unable to fall asleep. To me, my voice sounded strange, too tight, too high. Richard started taking his shirt buttons off. His motions are robotic. Then he paused and took a whiff of the air. My blood became icy. He is aware. When Richard picked up Richard's abandoned t-shirt, the one he had ripped off me an hour earlier, from the floor, his eyes furrowed. Had a similar scent to us. "You don't own this." Not a question, but a statement. I was chilly. I took it out of Richard's laundry. Richard's fingers gripped the cloth more tightly. I feared for a split second that he might put it to his face and breathe in the truth. Instead, without saying another word, he dropped it like something tainted and went to the bathroom. The shower started up. I didn't breathe again until the hallway was closed by the click of Richard's bedroom door. 3 days went by in a blur of averted gazes and quiet meals. Richard completely stopped touching me, ceased talking unless absolutely required. But what really made my hand shake was the way he gazed at Richard, like if he were trying to solve an unbalanced equation. Richard then cornered me in the study on Thursday night while holding a manila envelope. I got a proof. The world swayed. What? Not for Richard. Richard had a narrow smile. For you. The envelope was slid across the desk by him. There were pictures within. An hour away, Richard and I were in the parking lot of a motel, my legs encircling his waist. Time-stamped receipts from Richard's visits to the golf course in the afternoons. Even worse was a blurry video still of Richard walking into our bedroom the evening Richard arrived home early. Calmly, Richard said, "You have until morning to tell him, or I will." In the moonlight, I discovered Richard by the pool, shirtless, with his beard hanging from his fingers. He knew after glancing at my face. He is aware. Richard's face remained unchanged. And I almost burst out laughing. Richard, he's your stepfather. Our lives are. He's not my dad. Richard pressed himself up against me. You're not my mother either. Both of us are aware of who we are. He moved his hand up my leg. Possessive fingers pressing in. The same fingers that were within me only a day before. I ought to have shoved him aside, had to run. However, I wanted him to continue. I leaned in instead. How do we proceed? Richard pressed his mouth to my ear. We destroy everything by burning it. On my way back to our room, Richard started packing. I stood in the doorway, and he didn't glance up. My whole body was shaking. I'll tell everyone, he muttered. Your parents, the country club, the board of medicine. I'll see to it that you never again reveal your identity in this community. The threat would have devastated me a month ago. I went to the closet and took out my suitcase immediately. Take the necessary action. With a look of surprise on his face, Richard looked up at last. He's your choice. I didn't respond. Continued packing. In actuality, I wasn't going to pick Richard. I was picking myself. It was me who desired. It was me who took. The me who, after decades of pretending to be dead, felt alive at last. I pulled my bag out in the morning to see Richard waiting in the driveway. Without saying anything, he snatched it from me. Silently, our fingers brushed together. I didn't glance back at the home as we drove away. I didn't question whether Richard was observing. That was all I could think. This shouldn't be how I feel. However, Richard's hand found my thigh. He strokes my garment, making circles with his thumb. I only felt liberated. You can't lose what you never truly had, so the saying goes. However, I did. I forgot who I was. On a Tuesday, the divorce papers arrived. When Richard went, he didn't even bother to look me in the eye. I left everything behind and only packed his golf clubs, his suits, and the framed picture of us from our honeymoon. The language was harsh. All I had left was a meager alimony and the clothing in my closet. After signing the prenuptial agreement all those years ago, when I was still a believer in fairy stories. The home. He owned my home, which I had furnished room by room. Our social circle, our buddies, even the reading group that I had run for a decade. But the stillness was far worse than all of it. The quiet of waking up by yourself. Richard's laughter in the kitchen was gone. And there was silence. The realization in silence that I had become into everything my father had forewarned me I would be. A woman whose hunger has wrecked her. My final encounter with Richard. He made a final visit 2 weeks after Richard's departure. My preferred explanation is foreclosure. For one last delicate moment, when we bid farewell and admitted what we had done. However, it wasn't. His duffel bag was thrown over one shoulder as he stood in the doorway. I'm halfway through my life already. Without looking at me, he replied, I got a job in Seattle. I'm going tonight. My fingertips touched his wrist as I grabbed for him. Did any of it happen? His mask dropped for a moment. A moment. After having nightmares, I saw the boy I had reassured. I had assisted the adolescent with applying to colleges. At one point, the young man had called me mom without hesitation. However, he was my stepson and 22 years old. Then it vanished. Is it important? He left without turning around. I made an effort to reconstruct. Took a modest flat on the other side of town. Obtained freelancing design employment. I even had several uncomfortable dates with men who were unaware of my past. However, I always saw him when I closed my eyes. His hands touched my skin. He prayed while he muttered my name, and I heard it. I tasted his sweat salt when A single mail with no return address showed up 6 months later. Within a clipping from the newspaper, a pediatric surgeon and Dr. Miles have announced their engagement. Below that, in Richard S. sloppy handwriting. I suppose we both lost. In the sink, I burned it. I now appear older. The woman's cheeks are hollow as she stares back at me. Her eyes were shadowed. Lips that have lost the ability to grin. I sometimes ponder what could have transpired if I had initially pushed Richard away. Had I been more powerful? If I had performed better? That's the problem with fire, though. When it eats you, all that's left are ashes. This is the secret about forbidden passion that no one tells you. You are not destroyed by guilt. It's not the embarrassment. Not even the loneliness is the problem. It's the awareness. Knowing that you would repeat everything. Knowing that you would exchange every moral and every promise. For one more touch, give your entire being. In your heart, you know that you are the same person they have been warning you about. The worst part, too, you're not even concerned. You've now traversed the rubble of my decisions. How would you have handled the situation differently? This is a mirror, not just my tale. A mirror of the boundaries we all believe we will never cross. Until we are pushed to the limit by life. The questions that trouble me and ought to trouble you as well. If you had sensed his hardness against you, would you have retreated? Or would you have also been deceived by your body? Instead of pushing away, arch closer. Would you have been able to stop after the initial kiss? Or would you, like me, have repeatedly found reasons to be close to him? When did I start acting like the bad guy? Was it the initial contact, the initial deception, or the time I put pleasure ahead of anything I had ever believed? This is a secure place for your confessions. Leave an anonymous comment below. I've never gone too far. However, I've dreamed it. My marriage is equally meaningless. How near am I? You are abhorrent. I couldn't stop reading, though. Don't judge. No embarrassment. The unadulterated truth. The narrative continues. For the next confession, subscribe. Indeed, there is video evidence. To ensure you don't miss anything, turn on alerts. We are all turned into monsters by loneliness. What sort of monster are you turning into? That's the only question. Learn. Mrs. Carter once. Another warning story then.